Thank you very much, Asti. A very warm welcome to our panelists, to Haslam as moderator, but in particular to all of you, members of BritCham, and we also have an awful lot of visitors here. So welcome on this occasion to become part of this BritCham community. This is a very, very topical subject. Indonesia is under pressure to explain how it's going to drive itself forward and, of course, keep itself very, very relevant in the highly competitive space of foreign investment. I'm not going to talk more about the title, except to say that what we're going to talk about today is the outcome of a tremendous piece of work, which, again, I'll leave the panelists and I'll leave the moderator to go into in much more detail and with greater relevance. What I'd really like to do is to welcome and thank very much for his time, Haslam Prieston today. As Asti mentioned, he is the former chairman of BritCham, so if that face looked familiar, that's the reason why. Well, I certainly had the pleasure of 3 years working under Haslam's guidance in that role. But Haslam also has a very relevant current role to this particular subject as well. He's the head of digital business at the Jardine Group. Haslam was appointed Jardine Group's head of digital business in June 2019. He's responsible for developing the group's digital and innovation strategy and also the implementation of programs to support digital transformation and growth strategies across the group. Following an early career in the British Army, he joined the Jardine Matheson Group in 2001, where he undertook roles in a number of businesses, including Jardine Motors, Hong Kong Land, and prior to his current role, he was the regional managing director of Jardine Cycle and Carriage, with responsibility for overseeing motor operations in Singapore, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Indonesia. He has an MA in Chinese Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Asti also mentioned Haslam has a role on the board of the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, and I sincerely hope that my colleagues don't plan to whack a bill to me for a license fee for borrowing him today. Haslam, thanks very much for rejoining us and our community, and I'd just like to hand over the baton to your very, very safe hands.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm very flattered by your introduction. I don't think people are here today to listen to me. They're here to, of course, to listen to our three panelists, Michele, Carlos, and Yurendra. Just a little bit more about Michele before we kick off, and his other two colleagues. Michele provides expertise in industrial economics for all the projects undertaken with the policy link unit that he is running at the University of Cambridge. He's an economist and project manager with several years of experience in the consulting sector and in academia, both in the UK and abroad. For Carlos, he has extensive research and consulting experience in the fields of industrial and innovation policy. He's advised several national and regional governments, as well as international organizations, including the ADB and the World Economic Forum. For Yurendra, he leads economic analysis work at the Asian Development Bank as the country economist, and as well providing programmatic support to the ADB's operations in the country. Last year, he participated in the IMF's Article 4 consultation in Papua New Guinea and contributed to the special issues paper on inclusive growth. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. As Asti mentioned at the beginning, we'll have 60 minutes with a hard stop. We'll have about 30 to 40 minutes presentation and general panel discussion with about 20 to 30 minutes for questions at the end. The focus of the webinar today, as Chris mentioned, is Innovate Indonesia, Unlocking Growth Through Technological Transformation, which was commissioned by the Asian Development Bank in cooperation with the Indonesian Ministry of Finance. So what do we mean by technological transformation? I mean, I find, especially in my role, which has a digital in the title, people are often rather confused. They don't really know what it is that means. What does technology mean in the context of Indonesia? What does transformation mean when you put these two together? It's often termed Industry 4.0, or for the World Economic Forum, the fourth industrial revolution. So what does this mean in the Indonesian context? Just starting off with Michele first.
Yes, thank you very much, Aslam. Good afternoon, everyone, for who is attending from Asia, and good morning for who is attending from the United Kingdom and Europe. Well, actually, this is a very good question because that allows us to set up the scene to better understand what we actually did with this important study. By technological transformation, we mean how new technologies, not only the family of technology that belongs to the so-called Industry 4.0, fourth industrial revolution, can impact on the development, economic development and competitiveness of Indonesia. So why this is important? This is important because historically, innovation has been the main contributor to economic growth for both developed countries, already industrialized countries, and new emerging economies. But the most striking aspect that I would like to emphasize, and that has to do with this project, is the fact that assessing the impact that this kind of new technology, of which maybe Carlos will deep dive later more in depth, is not straightforward. So this is because each technology can have a different impact on the economy, and because an economy is a complex system, it's composed of several sectors. So it means that the same technology could have a different impact on different sectors as considered. So for this reason, it is important to not just provide the macroeconomic aspect. Now, in general, we say that if, sometimes we say that if a country innovates, so there will be economic growth. But to better understand this, we need to go into more detail. We need more granular analysis. And this is eventually to inform how government policies can manage the technological transformation. And for this reason, in this project, that's what we try to do in this project. We not only focus on manufacturing, but we also analyze, first of all, a range of new technologies, and also a range of sectors that span from manufacturing, financial services, the so-called fintech, energy, e-commerce, and also the implication for urban planning. And in addition to this, we'd also, in addition to the standard economic analysis, we also undertook extensive consultation through survey and through workshop with local stakeholders in Indonesia, from industry, because we believe that only the local stakeholder can understand better than others the economic and social context of a country, and help to inform what could be the government policies. I don't know if Carlos wants to add something about
Well, actually, I might, putting that question to Carlos as well. I mean, Carlos, is the concept of technological transformation, is that universally understood when you're speaking to the local stakeholders? Do they really understand what you're talking about there, or is there different definitions of what that means?
Hi, good afternoon, Haslam. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you to the BRICAM Indonesia for organizing this, and for ADB to make all this possible. No, I think that's a great question. I think we have definitely an issue of definitions. So even if among the international organizations, among different countries and different organizations within a country, will have different definitions of what Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution, or whatever the term it is. But more practically speaking, when you talk to companies, the perception and the awareness of what the technology means to their business is very different. One of the key findings of the report of this study was that there is a lack of knowledge and there is a lack of understanding, and it's very understandable why this is. Things are changing rapidly. We're bombarded by terms. Sometimes these terms are not explained, And what companies have told us is that they want to understand what does it actually mean for the business. How can they get a new product, a new service, a new process that actually drives competitiveness. I guess but when we talk to the companies, again, just emphasizing Michele's point, is that the answer will be different for different types of firms in different parts of the value chain, competing in different geographical locations. So what is true, however, is that many of these technologies that we're talking about are becoming cheaper, are more widely used, are more widely understood. And now we have a lot of case studies in which we can look at how companies use them effectively to increase their value added, the sophistication of their activities, their market share. So I think despite the differences in definitions that you mentioned, I think what is important now is that we can show and companies can see, can feel, and can understand because we have data, we have proof of concept, and companies are adopting them now. So it is not longer a conceptual issue. We have examples, and you'll see in the report that we try to show many of these examples, and we think that's a way of communicating these policies because it's becoming a reality.
Before I come to sort of an economic sort of view on this, with Yurendra, I mean, one question I might add or ask there is, I mean, companies like Toyota and Hyundai and other major manufacturers of, and many British companies have been in Indonesia for decades. What's changed now? Why is this now important? And what do you think has changed in the Indonesian context that makes your report timely?
Yeah, thanks, Aslam. I'd also like to say a very warm good afternoon to everyone tuning in. Well, just following on from what Michela and Carlos said, before I get to what's changed and why is this important, I think I also want to stress two key things. First, the motivation here is really, not technology for the sake of technology, but technology being an instrumental driver of developmental outcomes. You can quantify that in growth or whatever. And also very important to stress the point that Michela made, that if we look at the history, and I've always been curious of economic history, technology has played a central role in economic catch-up historically. So that's one fundamental point, I think, which is quite important. So from that lens, you look at and you ask, how can technology help transform Indonesia's economy towards a higher level of growth, or higher growth path that is both sustained and inclusive. Now, when we look at Indonesia, and we can go into the details through next series of discussions, but from a bird's eye view, Indonesia had sustained high growth pre-Asian financial crisis, 7-8%. And there are different interpretations to it, but one of that was being driven by increasing share of manufacturing value added. That is also the time where to go to the point that you are raising, investments like in automotive sectors, textiles, and others were taking place. They were, of course, part of a regional value chain. Back in that time, the famous flying geese model was prevalent. And so they were part of that arrangement. Post-Asian financial crisis, you had an issue where infrastructure investments reduced. Indonesia started losing some of its competitive edge. In terms of labor, Indonesia has a large labor pool, but then countries like Bangladesh were chipping away. So you've now come to this point where if Indonesia is to regain its competitive edge, if Indonesia is to regain that growth momentum, it has to reinvest in those fundamental infrastructure to support technological changes. But at the same time, it has to do it smartly, because now it is not competing with Bangladesh. It cannot be competing with Bangladesh or Cambodia. It has to compete with the likes of India and China. So there again, we, in the report, I'm putting it slightly differently, but asking that question, what does that mean? Because technology is not standing still. It's constantly evolving. So where does Indonesia stand? Where are the weaknesses? What are the strengths? And where do the opportunities lie?
So perhaps one add to that, not only has technology is really, in terms of technological advancement, reached almost an exponential kind of phase, but also the competitive environment as a result, or through other developments, is also very different now for Indonesia, and it can't rely on its traditional strengths. Therefore, the imperative to take advantage of technology is that much greater.
And perhaps if I may add, Haslam, is also, you have the technology on one side, the geopolitical context, international competition, all these issues. Obviously, we have a tremendous shock to the system with the COVID-19 pandemic. Another big trend that we discuss is also the changing customer demands. That also drives technological transformation. So think about the stuff that we want in our cars, the kind of clothes that we want that are more personalized. So personalized items across industry, for example, are really changing the way companies are thinking about delivering those products locally. We want them now, we want it in a different color, we want it in a specific taste, and we wanted to buy it in a different way. We want to buy it online, perhaps, rather than going to the shop. So we need to develop the different solutions that are demanded. So we have both supply issues in the technology that is becoming cheaper. I think it is, you talk about the exponential advances in the technological side. Yes, we're doing more research and we're increasing the functionalities, but part of the transformation or the revolution, if you wish, it is related to accessibility, the democratization of those technological solutions because they're becoming cheaper. So, back in the day, a simple sensor for vibration, for example, to check how machines are working, used to cost hundreds of dollars, or if not thousands, but now you can get it for a few tens of dollars. So that really opens up so that the possibility that technology is not only used by the big players, but also smaller ones, and that creates a big impact as well.
But you speak about the democratization of platforms, of access to technology, the ability of very small scale businesses now to access that kind of technology. But during your deep dive in preparing your report, you said that only 6% of firms reported that they are utilizing advanced technology and becoming digitally enabled tools, and general adoption is low for all technologies in the survey. Why is that?
Well, I can answer on this. Actually, let me first say that this is not bad, because this is in line with what we experience on research conducted in other countries, both advanced countries and emerging economies. So in every country, there is always a small group of leaders, or leading companies that use the state-of-the-art technologies, while there is a much larger base of the pyramid that is still basic in terms of use this kind of technology. Why this happened? Well, Aslam, actually you already answered partially this question, because this has to do even with the institutional framework, with the ecosystem. So it's not enough that someone in the US or in Europe or even in Indonesia will create a new technology and this will be ready, available for everyone. It's possible, and this is what we found, particularly in Indonesia, that companies do not know the existence of such a technology, or they are not aware about the feasibility, economic feasibility of adopting such a kind of technology and the potential impact that this technology could have on the production and on the delivery of service, for example, or on in terms of creating also new product or improved product that are already produced. So for this reason, there are also other challenges that we found, particularly in Indonesia. Lack of information, as I said, is one of them, but there is also a kind of resistance to change, as well as regulatory barriers that prevent such companies to access this new technology. In this respect, so there is scope for policy intervention that government policy could facilitate the adoption and the diffusion of this new technology within the Indonesian economic system. So just to stress the point, and then I conclude, it's not only important to create a new technology. What is even more important is that companies adopt this technology, so that the technology is first diffused in the economic system and then is adopted by the company. And for this reason, government intervention could definitively support, could definitely have a scope and support in this process.
We're just looking at it for a moment at the policy environment. And perhaps I'll direct this first question to Yurendra. What is Indonesia doing right now in your assessment? What are the things they're doing well? And where could they, before we look at the 5 pillars for policy action you recommend, where do you think they could do better?
Yeah, thanks. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to maybe briefly touch on the previous question and make 2 points. One is that this is perhaps I'm speaking more for the policy community. An important realization through the study was that, and something that we often forget, it's firms that purchase and utilize these technologies, and therefore their perspective is paramount, and often that gets sort of sidelined. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that firms are the ones that are purchasing, utilizing these technologies, and they operate within a risk competitive framework on where they want to make these purchases. And we've already talked, Michaela mentioned about regulatory barriers, and there are other things that we've also discussed in the report. The second point I thought I should highlight is that in Indonesia, in addition to what Michaela was saying, we also see if I can use the word, fragmentation of these backward supply chains. So you have, as 6% advanced technology. Global. I'm not familiar with the global benchmark, but as going with what Michaela said, that's a decent number. The issue is, how does that trickle down to the entire supply chain? What is the technological adoption and upgrading that's happening? If we can use the example that you threw in earlier, Haslam, Toyota, for example. How is technological upgrading happening along its entire supply chain? Right? So that's an important aspect. And I think, in my view, there are greater gains to be made by upgrading the supply chain than, say, the lead firm. Because Toyota knows what the latest technologies are. They know where to get them. They know how to adopt them. It's the capacity and the capability of the supply chain that's going on. Now, coming to the question you asked me, I think maybe good to start by saying that the key question that we started this analytical work, and I should say that it has been a journey, because we started and we didn't know, sort of, it was iterative and evolved as we went along. But at the point when we started this work, there were a couple of things that was very clear. The technology was changing at an extremely rapid pace globally. And this is, as Michaela was saying, this is what's happening across the sectors, as Carlos was saying, even the way we consume. And technology, it almost felt like the shelf life of technology was reducing, coming into the market so quickly. And that's the global context. And again, standing from Jakarta, from Indonesia, and looking out, one wonders if the global economy is changing in the way it is, what implications does that have for Indonesia, for its development, economic development prospect? So that was really, the crux of the motivation when we started this in partnership. It was requested by Ministry of Finance, and we were doing this research for them in collaboration with other line ministries, to really shed light on what is happening out there. What implication does that have for Indonesia? What are Indonesia's strengths? Doing a deep diagnostic assessment of what's happening within Indonesia, and where the opportunities exist for Indonesia to capitalize. And when we did that, we always had that Indonesia's medium to long-term vision as the frame. So the questions that we were asking was, if Indonesia aspires to get to this level in the next 10, 20 years, what does that mean when you look at it from the technology prism? What changes Indonesia needs to do? And then from there, what has changed and what Indonesia has been doing? One of the key highlights, I think, from is that over the last couple of years, we've clearly seen Indonesia stepping up on the infrastructure gap. More still needs to be done, but that was, if I may, an outstanding element that was holding back its potential, and a lot of investment has happened. There's also been improvements in the overall regulatory environment. Indonesia has been doing well in the doing business indicators. So there have been, and it has invested in, for example, some of the internet broadband links. So there have been many of these improvements that we've observed over the last couple of years. I should add,
But is Indonesia moving? Do you think is Indonesia moving fast enough? I mean, is it, we talked about the competitive environment at the end. I mean, Michele might like to touch on this. I mean, there's if you think you're moving fast, your competitors are moving faster. Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia, one of the largest countries in Asia. It's a big country to move. Is it moving at the pace it needs to in order to remain competitive? Michele?
Yes, thank you. Well, what we saw in our study is that there are several policies that have been implemented, especially in the very last year, to foster economic transformation in Indonesia. This has to do not only with companies targeted to companies, but also to general policy that regards infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. However, despite that, we saw that the ecosystem, the Indonesia ecosystem, what we call the national innovation system, still lag behind compared to other Asian countries. This has to do, for example, with investment in research and innovation, with the ability of companies, of firms to perform research and innovation, and for the availability of skills. This is maybe the one of the key feature of the Indonesian economy. Although, as you said, Indonesia has a large population. So overall, we expect, for example, that in the future we will have, in absolute numbers, a pool of STEM, it's called science technology graduates. However, if compared to other countries, the OECD countries, for example, the share of people with tertiary education is still relatively low. So policies are needed in this respect. However, this doesn't have to do only dealing with skills, doesn't have to do only with the reforming the educational system. This has to do also on working with companies or with vocational training to upgrade the skill set of each student or potential worker. So in this respect, just to conclude, the government definitively has done several things, has implemented particular important policy in the last years, in research also, in infrastructure, as I said, but there are still opportunities that can be exploited to make Indonesia grow at a level that will become in the future high income economies.
So is what you're saying there, I mean, because I think Indonesia undeniably already has a number of very successful multi-unicorns, such as Gojek, Tokopedia, amongst others. So is what you're saying here is that with better education, with the right kind of government policies, because some would argue that that things must be okay if these companies are already growing at such a pace. Or are you saying that their emergence and the emergence of other similar platforms and businesses is inherently limited by the lack of access to skilled workers?
Well, education is just a part of the story. But even in the case of the startup ecosystem in Indonesia, which is available particularly in Jakarta, we have seen also reviewing other studies, for example, that lack of skills in ICT training, ICT trained professionals is still constraining. So there is a good innovation and startup technology startup innovation ecosystem that is growing, that has achieved enormous success, like the case of Gojek, for example, another unicorn. But if we had more technological trained professional, maybe it could have grown more. But as I said, this is the educational skills is only a part. It's only a part of the study. We need to consider other things. For example, access to fast internet, and then the regulatory framework, for example. What can be done, what cannot be done in the fintech, for example, and so on.
Carlos, what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I would like the issue of convergence here, because I think we sometimes forget that on one hand, you can have these ICT specialized companies and they do everything in the cyber world. But we sometimes, and we've seen this in an international experience, we forget about the physical world, the connection between the ICT and industry in, for example, manufacturing, right? So the fourth industrial revolution is underpinned by what we call the cyber physical systems, which is sensors, actuators, control systems coming together to make the operations more efficiently. So for example, if you look at the discussions that are happening in Germany, which also has a problem with diffusion and that not many SMEs are involved in these initiatives, they are the ones who coined the term Industry 4.0 and they're still lagging behind. One of the things I find is that we shouldn't, of course, we have to have more ICT professionals. And at the beginning, they were discussing, we need to have more mechanical engineers that understand ICT. But a lot of the analysis lately has been, actually, we also need more ICT professionals that understand industry, so that these generate technologies that have cross-cutting applications can find their way to particular industries. The same sensors, the same systems could be utilized in electronics or in automotive or in food processing. But we need the skills to transfer those technologies and achieve real convergence. Take the technology, apply it for the specific industry, for the particular needs of the company, and making sure that that creates value to the business. And that goes back to the point that you asked before. Why are companies not using them? Why is it slow? It has to do a lot with the business case. And part of the business case will only be demonstrated when these different communities talk together.
Thanks, Carlos. And I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming in, so please do keep them coming. But one from Fadil here is talking about, both government and the private industry, having ambitions to embrace technological innovation to improve both industry and private business, but there are huge disparities between regions. And perhaps I'll direct this to Yurendra. How can technology help to maybe redress some of these regional disparities you see in Indonesia? It's an enormous country, huge population. I do remember when I first started working in Indonesia, I was told the distance from end to end, I don't know if this is correct, but it's the same distance from London to Baghdad as at one end of Indonesia to the other. It's a very diverse, economically, ethnically, and economically country. So how can technology be used to redress some of these imbalances?
I would argue that technology is perhaps central to reducing that disparity, and I'll come to why. With the current experience right now, with the social distancing because of the COVID-19 situation, you have education, for example, is being delivered by technological mediums, and regions that have better internet access households that have better products like computers or iPads are going to continue with the learning outcomes, whereas regions that don't are going to lag, and by no fault of their own, just because they don't have access to them. So at a very basic level of providing public services like health and education, technology is becoming critical, and now not just about catch up, but making sure that that divide doesn't get even larger. But thinking from a more economic point of view, I think for Indonesia, and I think I would want to connect that technology to manufacturing and the production side of things. What is really required is, again, going back to that supply chain and the feedback loop. Indonesia will need to find a way to make its production base more dispersed across its region. And as at the moment, it's as we know, it's heavily concentrated in the island of Java, and we'll have to find a way that it can be dispersed to other regions. And that doesn't mean just manufacturers like automotives, but it can be various products. And I think technology can play a critical enabling role in allowing those supply chains to emerge, because Java or Jakarta is still going to be the major business center, but technology can be utilized for having these supply chains move out, enable them to still remain competitive. So I think there's, just to by saying that I think technology is fundamental and critical right now to make sure that the divide doesn't increase. And technology, we need to think about smart technological solution to close the divide as well. So both sides.
Thanks, Yurendra. Just looking at questions here again, Jacinta from President University has commented that some of her students have done some research on Indonesian HR managers and found that relatively low understanding and willingness to adapt the use of new technology, and indeed perhaps a sense of complacency and a lack of urgency about adaptation to new and utilization of new technology. Carlos, I mean, is that borne out by your research as well?
Yes, definitely. I think that's precisely something that we find with the awareness, the first, and probably jumping ahead, but that's why we highlight as a pillar of policy action, increasing this awareness of the value of new technologies, demonstrating it, creating use cases. We show examples from Colombia, Singapore to Denmark about how industry comes together to share best practice. Sharing best practice goes a long way for this, but the case stories need to be created and shared with the community so that people actually can see it, can feel it. We also talked about, I think this was a very clear message because of the cost being reduced. One of the issues is that in the survey that we conducted as part of the project, ADB conducted as part of this project, the main barrier that companies suggested was financial barriers. That's why we made emphasis in the low cost plug and play technology solutions as another thing that is also can be actually can reach other regions because it's cheaper. So we have to go. We have to break that barrier of just thinking that technologies are going to be expensive. Actually, many of these things are cheaper now. And by helping companies start with simple solutions that are easy to use, then we believe that will raise awareness. And international experience shows many cases in which they start with something simple and then they actually then become part of what we call the innovation system.
Well, thanks, Carlos. And maybe just starting to get into the five pillars for policy action that's been outlined in the report. I mean, just focusing for a second on that, low cost plug and play technology solutions. Is that a policy action? Is this a government policy action, or is this really a private sector solution that the private sector must be unleashed to be able to and encouraged to be able to provide those solutions? I'm open to any of you for that.
I think
actually.
Maybe Michele.
Oh, okay, I will start and then Carlos. But basically, this has to do with what Carlos already said. So there are technologies, but is it important that companies will be aware of the feasibility and the application, even how this technology work? And in this case, yes, there is a scope for policy intervention, for government policy, for creation, for example, the creation of intermediate research center that can show how demonstrator that can show how this technology work, or even by, for example, promoting the cooperation with a large firm that could be both Indonesian or multinational firm, to work in cooperation with small firm along the value chain, to try to better understand how to teach smaller firm how this new technology work, and how to use them for the production process. So yes, so this is not that, doesn't have to do only with firm strategies, but also with policy, with government policies.
We've talked quite a bit about, you know, the fifth pillar of your policy action, which is tech-savvy workforce. We talked about the fourth, which is just now low-cost plug-and-play technology solutions. One of the pillars is technology transfer and technical support for firms. I'm just wondering whether that first part, technology transfer, will that, bearing in mind, you know, experience of companies elsewhere on technology transfer, will that raise a little bit of a red flag with companies? Or could you explain a little bit more about what you mean, perhaps Yurendra, what you mean by technology transfer in this case?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe I'll call on Michaela to supplement what I say, but I just want to add that going back to the point, and just to echo what what you said, unleashing the private sector is the key. And I think, you know, even though this research is about, you know, building that evidence base, and, you know, it's slightly oriented towards a public policy community, but the thrust, very much the thrust, is about, you know, how do we unleash the private sector to take advantage of this. And just to highlight plug and play that Carlos mentioned, is to say that, look, you know, we don't even have to get fancy about it. There are all these technologies available off the shelf. Help companies understand what they are, you know, help them, because there are risks involved in adopting these, and it can be huge for small companies, right? So help them understand the business case, the business value of it, so that we can adopt. On technology transfer, coming to technology transfer, this is something that I started off with. I think there's now, you know, how do you incentivize the lead firms in the chain to also transfer some of these knowledge and capabilities downstream into the supply chain, and how do you unlock that to happen? Because as for me at least, I see that as both a win but also a constraint that needs to be unwound, and probably, you know, huge gains to be leveraged, is by building up the capacity of these suppliers, who tend to be medium and small enterprises, and building the technological capability can substantially upgrade. You know, the diffusion effect could be huge. But again, there the role is again more for the lead firm, and how do we incentivize the lead firm to see that there is value in downstreaming these technological knowledge and know-how. But Michaela, Carlos, please supplement if I missed.
If I just may add something, because I think that was a great question, Heslam. I mean, who should do it? And in that particular case, we have some examples in the report of in Singapore, for example, this was mainly driven by the public sector. So through a research and technology organization, the low-cost solutions are being deployed with public resources. In Japan, was started from the private sector industry associations coming together. 30 companies said, we have a common problem, let's find a cheap solution that helps for everybody. But it was so successful that it was then adopted as a national policy. So, and in other countries, even the UK, this has been done mainly from coming out from academia. So yeah, I mean, I guess the key point is what Yurendra mentioned, is the final goal is to unleash the private sector. It might start from different places. And that's why it is so related to technology transfer. When we talk about technology transfer, we also talk about the institutions, the mechanisms, the sources of support that companies have or don't have in the country to be able to compete. Right now we are at a crossroads because, for example, Japan is coming with the China Plus One strategy. Many other countries are looking to diversify regional supply chains. They want to have another base outside China. Indonesia is part of that set of countries that are going to be competing for that investment. But one of the things that companies are going to be looking at is how are the conditions, how much support we have, how likely it is for us to get the workers that we need. And that part of when we talk about technology transfer, we just don't talk within practices within the company, but the institutions in the country that make it competitive.
Well, I think that's it's an excellent point there, because one of the questions I've had here is, how do, in order, for example, in the area of fintech, how to tackle the very, stringent regulation in the area of financial services and technology. What is the best way to address that? Do you have any solutions or ideas about that? Because of course, Indonesia has a very strong central bank and regulatory agencies for very good reason. So how do you strike that balance between regulation and allowing the private sector to flourish?
I can start. Yeah, I can take a stab at it. I must confess, I'm not a fintech expert, but in Indonesia, I think again, some of the innovations are not just limited to Gojek, the mobility services. There's innovation happening even within the fintech space, the payment gateways and services. And I think here, the OJK has played quite an innovative role, the Financial Services Authority. So they've been innovating on the regulatory side with Sandbox and looking at examples from US to elsewhere. So I think there's been quite a lot of ongoing improvements in that area. I think, having said that, and this is something we found in our research as well, you have a very interesting situation in Indonesia where the fintech is happening slightly outside of the banking sector. These are the players, actors in that space are outside the banking sector. The banks, the dominant banks, at least there are a handful of them, they are still focusing on their core business, and they see this fintech perhaps with a bit of, if I could use the word skepticism, a bit of risk. So they do not perceive it as that fintech is going to disrupt their core business. So what we found was, and this is through interviews with the banking sector, was that they see the situation evolving where you'll have a cohabitation of banks doing the core banking services, and you'll have these fintech companies providing fintech solutions. And there could be situations where banks maybe co-opt or purchase some of these fintech companies as they become big. But the trend is likely to be one of cohabitation. So again, these are interesting dimensions of things that are happening in Indonesia. And I think OJK is, seems to be on top of things to understand that context and put out the necessary regulations.
I guess in the era of the super apps, Gojek and Grab being examples, I guess the traditional financial services providers will have to learn to live with them, or co-opt them, or maybe it's the other way around. And just working through the 5 pillars again, looking at the second here, which is awareness of the business value of new technologies. You underline that as an area that should be focused on, because it's simply lack of knowledge, and also how to build the business case and how that, for example, if you're looking at bringing in efficiencies or finance, modernizing your back office and so on, how do you balance that? When businesses thinking, well, the cost of having a lot of clerks here, producing financial reports, yes, it takes a long time, but actually the cost of introducing new technology is greater than the efficiencies I generate. How does one explain the broader value of these new technologies and get firms to understand the value that bringing in efficiencies through technology can generate. Michele.
Yes, well, actually, this is the problem, is that they don't know the potential economic opportunity of this new technology, or they are not aware at all. So there is lack of information about the existence of the technology. Lacking of information means that they cannot do what the example that you just made. So they cannot assess if it is a benefit or a cost introduced. If introducing a new technology will lead to a benefit or a cost, because they don't know the value of the technology. So first of all, it is needed that within the companies, in particular at a management level, they know the value and the feasibility of introducing, the economic feasibility of introducing a new technology. And then there are, however, also the other constraints that we found from our study. For example, for sure there is a financial constraint, of course, but if you undertake many surveys in every country, every company will tell you that there are financial constraints, which it is true. I mean, we are not denying this. But here the point that we would have liked to make is that they lack the kind of information that is needed to conduct, basically speaking, a cost-benefit analysis relating to the introduction of new technology. This is the key. This is the key point.
And Carlos and you, Andrew, do you have anything to add to that point?
I think one of the practices that because in the report we show some of what other countries are doing in practice. One of the things that we found very useful, and I think we have heard very good things from companies that are using it, is Japan, France, and Germany have created a map, and they use actually a common framework. And what they do is they show examples of how different companies in different regions of the country use a Google map. And they say, okay, that company in that sector did this, it cost this much, and they achieved these things. So very simple use cases like that, and they go building this database. We're trying to do something similar here in the UK as well. But that very simple sharing of information has been highly effective in what we have heard.
And that's kind of a relatively low cost, relatively simple and transparent way of enablement of technological improvement by information. Just working. Sorry, Yurendra, please go ahead.
I just want to do one minute quick intervention on this. I think very important for the recommendations to be seen as, in most of the experiences, there needs to be a trilateral arrangement between public, private, and the research community. And I think that's a larger point that, so we've got these specific recommendation clusters of recommendations, and Carlos and Michela can correct me. Where we've seen that transformation really happen is when you have this very tight dialogue happening between these three key pillars, the public, the private, and the research community. Because the public needs to listen to what the private sector, what their constraints are, but the private sector also needs to appreciate why this technological upgrading is important for the whole country or for the and the research community needs to understand how do you respond to the need in that innovation. So that the trifecta, I think, is very important in that institutional sense to get that right.
I think that's a very important point. And we're just conscious of time here. We've only got 3 minutes. We've really ripped through time here a lot faster than I thought we would. So, but just a couple more points. And I am trying to get to a few more of these questions. But first, I think that's an excellent point about the research environment. It's an area where it's not a fair comparison. It's a small country where Singapore is particularly strong in bringing together the private sector, government, and research, and that is a very powerful combination. It's an area perhaps that Indonesia really should be looking at leveraging further, because it does have a wide range of higher education institutions. But just touching for a second on the startup environment, I don't know how confident any of the three of you feel about speaking about this, but how would you assess the, and this is a question from the floor, how do you assess the enabling environment for startups, which is really an essential part of this whole picture here? You know, is the environment a conducive one in Indonesia for startups? Is there anything that needs to be done, government action perhaps, in any way? Perhaps, Carlos, if I can ask you to answer that one. It's a slightly tricky question.
So just to confirm, your question is about the startup environment.
Yeah, the startup environment. Yeah.
I guess one of the things that we noticed before you ask about the strengths and what are the opportunities in Indonesia, one of the things we noticed in terms of the activities, and you ended up talk about infrastructure, investment policies, but we did also notice that as part of efforts of research reform that are taking place in the country, there has also been investment in incubation and basically startup support centers in universities. So obviously that is something that people said has been welcome, but also, as you mentioned as well, we heard also from some companies saying there is a lot of activity, but still we don't find the amount and the type of skills that we require in our companies. And I think there have been a lot of discussion about where companies should locate their the research centers, for example. One of the things we found very useful as well in other projects has been, and I'll go back to my initial point, merging the digital services, the digital startups with the more physical manufacturers, if you wish. That turns out to be a big source of innovation as well. Just those companies that have the ICT know-how and going and learning how they might apply it, that actually has created new businesses. Think about, for example, the ICT sector in Ireland that became very specialized in food production because they've just been talking to, or in pharma, or in chemical industry. And they become then leaders in the application of those ICT technologies in a specific production processes. So I think that is part of the networking and innovation system that we would like to see develop more in Indonesia. I think you're on mute, Aslam.
Oops, sorry. I know we're right on time now, and I know many people have only carved out 60 minutes for this. But I'll just finish up now by asking each one of you. It's really, if you bear in mind the report, the amount of research you've done, if there's any one thing each one of you could do that would really move the needle in driving improvements in the Indonesian economy through technological transformation, what would that be? Maybe starting off with Yurendra.
Thank you, Aslam, for starting with me, so I don't have to scratch my head to find the answer. You're very kind.
My pleasure.
I think investing in people, getting them ready, whether definitely technology, making them tech savvy, but also starting from the very basics, child education, nutrition, all of that, because innovation is going to come from people, and people need to be ready. So I would say to move the needle, we should see more investment in people.
Thank you. Carlos?
Yeah, I would say the demonstration of the technologies through use cases, to networking, to taking some of the companies and actually showcasing examples of how this can be done in Indonesia's context with the constraints that we have, and just sharing that information. I think that is the first step to unlocking the awareness, the understanding, and the adoption.
Thank you. Michele?
Well, I would go with following the effort of the government, investing even more in technological infrastructure, so communications and so on. Because maybe in Jakarta, it's already well developed, but Indonesia is big actually. So further investment is needed in technology and infrastructure as a basic to then develop all the other things that we discussed and analyze in the report.
Thank you very much. 3 powerful points to end today's conversation. Thank you all very much. Really, we went through time much more quickly than I anticipated there, and there's a lot more that we could have talked about. So thank you all very much. I'll now hand over to Chris for some final words.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Yes, indeed. I'm sure there was so much more could have been talked about. You could have had double the time. There were questions that I know that you tried to weave in, but just couldn't answer all of them. And we should apologize to those people who took the trouble to put questions and couldn't get an answer. We'll try to share those if we can. Just to let you know that all attendees will receive a link to the report if you haven't already, and also a recording of the discussion here today. Do feel free to share that far and wide, because this is a debate that needs to be had in much more detail in order for Indonesia to use technology as the driver for its economic outcomes. An expression used by Michele. Thank you to you, to Carlos, to Yurendra, to Edward, and for wonderful steering from Haslam throughout. To all attendees, thanks for joining us from whichever part of the world you're in and whatever time zone you're in as well. Please do remember that BritJam is known as the most active foreign chamber of commerce in Indonesia and driving thought leadership. And there are some other options there on your screen. If you're a non-member, my team will be in touch to offer you an exclusive membership proposition for those people who've been with us today. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Whatever is left of your day, we wish you a great one and a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.